Johannes Keating here. Epistemological humility, meaning not being overconfident about what we think we know. If I haven't made this clear already, let me do it right now. I speak to you as a fellow learner, not an expert. I actually don't even believe in the expert model because you look close enough at the so-called experts and they all have the same human foibles that we all do. So how about we're just fellow learners on this journey together, maybe at different legs of the journey, but nevertheless on the same path, in the same boat. Unfortunately, I think that there can be a trend in the ISTDP world to talk about ISTDP related matters as if the knowledge was handed down from up above, carved into stone, and I'd like to make a dent in that impulse. So here goes. So I want to talk about some clinical examples of scenarios where you have clinical phenomena that could go misunderstood or not worked with skillfully if you rely on the most easily or readily available hypotheses or educated guess as to the truth of what's going on in regards to the psychodynamics. So I'll get to some clear examples, but if you would allow me just a couple of minutes to first discuss some nuts and bolts issues that go to the foundation of what we do. I imagine it'll be a review for many of you, but nevertheless, this is so central to what we do that I think it's worth at least reviewing. And it could be a little stuffy. I'm going to do my best to speak as plainly as possible. So part of doing therapy, right, is developing a way of thinking based on our theories and understandings of human psychology, where various patterns are observed and then inferences lead to assessments and propositional conclusions as to what's taking place, and then predictions as to what will happen. We see this, we see that in our patients, we formulate a hypothesis, we test that hypothesis by intervening accordingly to what we believe is going on, and then the patient's response informs us as to whether or not there seems to be merit to our thinking about what's going on for the patient. Central to the scientific enterprise and the scientific method is guarding against confirmation bias, meaning that our underlying assumptions from which we base our thinking and through which we interpret the patient's responses can cloud our judgments and perceptions, leaving us essentially simply seeing what we want to see. We find what we're looking for. So to guard against this, we have what's called a null hypothesis, which is at least one alternative or rival educated guess or hypothesis as to what could be the real status of the patient's psychodynamics, in contrast with our original hypotheses and our original prediction. This allows our work to be falsified, meaning we can now have more confidence in our propositional conclusions. We can now more confidently ascertain whether or not we're just seeing what we want to see, whether or not our way of understanding the patient actually illuminates or has given us blinders, where we're unable to see things outside of our own theoretical filters. We all have to guard against this because we all use the filters of our assumptions to interpret and make sense of sensory data, our patients. The very nature of these assumptions is that they rest on underlying generalizations about psychology and human nature. But if we assume that in human beings, in addition to being patterned after various universal principles pertaining to our nature and how we function, we also allow for the idea that everyone is also unique, well, then it becomes crystal clear why we must be so careful when we use assumptions to understand our patients based on sweeping generalizations. In the discipline of statistics, they talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. A type 1 error is when the null or rival hypothesis is correct, but we mistakenly reject it, so we get a false positive. We see what we want to see. And that's what I'm afraid can easily happen to the ISTDP therapist. Type 2 errors are false negatives when we accept the null hypothesis as the truth when in fact it's not. It's important to understand these things for several reasons. But one of the reasons is that if you understand the nuts and bolts of the scientific method, you'll be able to question and see through overconfident statements and proclamations about how things really are, perhaps disguised in scientific language that give an air of certainty. You'll see the difference between a mainly theory-laden observation and an observation that sticks closer to the actual raw data at hand. So when it comes to research findings, make sure you don't assume that findings equate, ironclad truth. Good or robust research will highlight weaknesses in its design, will have large samples of a kind that can be largely generalized to populations outside the unique research setting, and there will be plenty of replications. In psychology especially, when we're dealing with things that are difficult to measure, underdetermination is really often the norm. So in plain English, that means that many different explanations for the same clinical phenomenon can often be offered. And that should inspire epistemological humility, meaning we need to be humble and not overconfident in what we think we know. I imagine that most of us have heard of anecdotal data of that one person who was maybe treated by Davinu himself or one of his students, had a ton of unlockings, but their lives were still quite neurotic, painful, conflictual. And I think that's a more common occurrence than we would like for it to be. So it's not quite equivalent to a black swan event, but it should serve the same function. If you're thinking that unlockings through pressure and challenge are always the best ways to go, you want to disabuse yourself of that notion promptly. So for those of you who don't know what the black swan event refers to, it's when the existing scientific paradigm around a given proposition or truth claim is fundamentally challenged by new and unexpected data that turns the existing paradigm on its head. Thomas Kuhn was very focused on these sorts of things and the social processes that go into maintaining various paradigms. I think he might have a field day if he were to study the ISTDP community. So basically, right, we only see white swans. We infer that therefore there are only white swans until one day a black swan is spotted, and now we have to chuck the theory, the entire paradigm, or the premise that there are only white swans. So this was a bit of a dry preamble, so let's keep it moving. Let me get to some concrete and specifics at this point. So a client is defiant. Defiance often means that the client is projecting their will. But this client isolates affect, relies on higher order defenses. So instead of automatically assuming that there is projection of will going on, look closer. You might find that the client isn't projecting their will at all, but is genuinely wanting to stick it to you, is getting real sadistic satisfaction from frustrating your desires, from defying you. So in this case, it would be critical that you don't just, ensure that you're not giving the patient anything to defy, which is a similar move that we make when we block projections. But in addition, in this scenario, you'll also need to help the patient see that though you don't like to fail, their defiance is creating more pain for the patient than for you or for anyone else. So you're dealing with a different beast when the patient is getting real satisfaction from defying you versus just projecting their will. And you'll need to help the patient do a cost-benefit analysis, giving up a reliable way of getting even that provides momentary satisfaction versus giving that up for more longer-term satisfaction and facing anger more directly at people who would be gratified at the patient's therapeutic progress, which would include the therapist. Another scenario. A client has the ego-adaptive capacity to tolerate higher doses of pressure. A simplistic approach would tempt you, then, simply to go for mobilization work and unlocking the unconscious at a high rise of complex transference feelings. That approach, by the way, can do wonders. But hang on. This particular patient, though he has the capacity, and at some level genuinely wants to do the work to get better, has had an unusually painful legacy of relational disappointments, leaving him tremendously wary and terrified of closeness. And you may find that you get better results with this patient by working at a lower level of rise of the complex transference feelings, chipping away at resistance by over and over providing a corrective emotional experience. This patient begins to get better and open up through the lower level restructuring and the repeated corrective emotional experiences. He may or may not one day respond well to a more intense approach, but by foregoing a knee-jerk reflex to go for a higher level of mobilization work just because you see the capacity, you might find that with this particular patient, he responds best to this other approach, and he finds that more helpful. I think of what Joan Whitmore in 1996 wrote in her article titled Paving the Royal Road, an overview of conceptual and technical features in the graded format of Davenlou's intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy. She alludes to something similar to what I'm saying. On page 25, when she's discussing which patients are suitable candidates for the graded approach, she writes, and I quote, "Some patients, though not structurally fragile, have a very low or moderately low capacity to tolerate anxiety, sometimes due to certain life experiences." I hope that you appreciate the level of complexity that the author here is opening a door to, that attending to those kinds of factors is also very, very important. So another common assumption is that if you see a sigh, that you should therefore begin to ask about feelings. That can yield very good results, but it's not something carved in stone. Davenlou made it clear that sighs tend to indicate that you're approaching the patient's unresolved emotional conflicts. But he never created an algorithmic instruction manual that said that therefore you should always ask about feelings. It's this kind of simplistic thinking that can get you into a lot of trouble. So sometimes, yes, you'll want to ask about feelings, sometimes not. It's always case specific. And the overall context is really what guides you, including the unique factors pertaining to the unique client sitting right in front of you. Or the client that seems to be a really good candidate for perhaps the standard approach of ISTDP or even the graded approach for that matter. But then when we start going down this road, something is off, and it eventually becomes clear that our application of the method is creating iatrogenic reactions in the patient, as the patient is perhaps correctly picking up on that we're working on them rather than with them. We apply a well-rehearsed, systematized set of interventions to the client, which replicates perhaps adverse childhood experiences of not being really seen, where people in the patient's life were focused on their own shtick rather than the patient. And in our application of ISTDP, if we don't do it relationally, this dynamic is replicated as the therapist, in a sense, then is correctly seen as laying a trip on the patient. So this can happen in many different formats. We might correctly see that anger is being turned on the self and proceed to invite anger towards us to resolve the self-attack. But if you haven't done enough foundational work around relationship building and getting the will online, your correct assumption about anger turned inward may be situated in a larger context that needs to take priority. So whenever we become focused on individual defenses and fail to see how the defenses are perhaps synchronizing into a larger defensive maneuver, like in the transference resistance situation, the same kind of issue occurs. So there are countless things like this that we need to understand if we're to avoid the trap of working myopically. So what I'm referring to can only be seen and corrected if we have the ability to zoom out for a bird's eye view. If we're too narrowly focused on just the immediate data in front of us, or overly focused on just, say, looking for the level of rise and complex transference feelings and threshold, and we don't really attend to other parameters, we miss things like this. We miss the forest for the trees. I could go on, but I believe my point is clear. Some heuristics, some shortcuts in thinking, where various data points have become very tightly linked to theory-laden assumptions about what is so and what needs to be done. Those can be useful guides. But you want to get away from simplistic assumptions that reduces what we do to simple formulas and rituals. We're such complex creatures. There are often multiple and layered factors and forces that bear down on us at any given point in time. So in closing, we never want to be too confident about our perceptions. We want to respect different viewpoints, and we always want to stay open to our own fallibility. Lastly, we want to be clear about what our theories and assumptions are that we're basing our thinking on, and then hold those theories and those assumptions spaciously. That'll be all for now. Thank you for watching.